church that we came from in Columbus was an inner city church. And it had a clothing room, which was a constant source of both joy and tension in the congregation, because somebody had to keep the clothing in good order. And for some reason, people that came in to use the clothing room just felt like they could just rummage through everything and then leave it all piled up. So that was a constant source. You know, it's like they hire people in stores to do that. But apparently, well, anyway, never got to see. Even 20 years away from it, I could still feel myself getting, so one time, the ladies, the clothing room ladies, which I'll charitably call them at this point, said to me, there's a guy coming into the clothing room every week, and he takes too many clothes. He's taking clothes all the time. We think he's probably selling them at a yard sale and profiting off of the thing that's supposed to be a gift to help him in his time of need. He's taking too much, and you can't understand him when he talks. And we're just, you know, really upset because he's, and I said, okay, I'll talk to him. So I go, I talk to the guy. Turns out he's from Tanzania in East Africa. And he's a Lutheran pastor from Tanzania in East Africa. In Tanzania, he has, I think it was 12 churches that he oversaw. And each week, he had to travel between the 12 churches. And because there was only him, they had to have worship on different times of the week. He had 8 children. And he was in Columbus going to Trinity Lutheran Seminary to get a further degree in Christian education so that he could go back to Tanzania and be of further service to his church. While he was here studying, one by one, he was bringing his children and his wife over to be here with him. So as they came, they couldn't afford to bring them all at one time because airfares are pretty expensive from Tanzania. So as they came, one at a time, he was getting clothing for them because they didn't have that much clothing in the first place. And when they got here, it was winter. So he's getting all this clothing, and the clothing room ladies, bless their hearts, were convinced that he was doing something nefarious. So unfortunately, that's how oftentimes prejudice and self-righteousness, even with the best of intentions, of course, the best of intentions, they just didn't want anybody getting too much, which is always a good thing. I'm just being facetious here. With the best of intentions, it's easy to see people who look different and talk different. He spoke English. He just spoke it with an accent that didn't match their Appalachian accent, so they couldn't get it really well. They look different, they talk different, they don't have the same practices that we do. They must be up to no good. That's kind of the way people think oftentimes. And it's so unfortunate because things like that happen. They were, after that had happened for about 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, they were rude to him. They didn't want him taking so much stuff, and they'd watch him suspiciously when he was getting his clothing and everything. He was just trying to be a good guy. Anyway, a good father, a good pastor. So the problem is that that's the way people who have been oftentimes for a long time in the church begin to look at people outside the church. It's easy after you've been in the church for a while and you make some progress in holiness and you make some progress in loving the Lord. It's easy to sort of forget where you came from. It's easy to forget what things are like out there when it's a snowy, cold climate. That's a metaphor I'm looking at. It's easy to forget what it's like when you don't have the love of God to sustain you. And so you begin to look at people that don't have that with, sort of suspicion and so on. So I want to look at this today because this is something for the new church officers, elders, and deacons that we're going to be ordaining and installing. and the trustees, as we'll be praying with them as they're installed today as well. Jesus calls Matthew Levi, and here it calls him Levi, but in Matthew it's clear that this Levi is known by another name, which is Matthew, and he's probably the guy who wrote the book of the Gospel of Matthew. So imagine the surprise of Matthew's former tax collector friends and the people that knew him and looked down on him because he was a filthy tax collector. He wrote the Gospel of Matthew. So that's one of the things that can happen. Jesus is going along. He calls Matthew to follow him, and Matthew gets up from the tax table and follows Jesus. In the first place, tax collectors were hated. They're always hated. Nobody likes tax collectors. Nobody likes the IRS. But in those days, they were especially hated because there weren't any laws governing how much they could collect. There was only laws governing how much they had to pay as the representative of the government back to the government, the provincial government that they were responsible to. So it was rife with graft and bribery, and people got rich doing that. The provincial government would say, okay, you have to give us, this is just an example, give us like 10 denarii per person in your district. And they would collect 20 or 25 or 30, whatever they could collect. And they would get all that money, and then they would pay the 10 to the provincial government. So they were not well-liked people. They were seen to be traitors to the people of Israel because oftentimes the Romans or the Herodians would hire someone who was an Israelite, perhaps disgruntled, perhaps down on their luck, and give them the authority and the power to be a tax collector, and voila, they're ripping off their own people. So they were not liked. They hung out with a shady group of people. We just went and saw the Star Wars movie yesterday. If you can imagine the bar scene in Star Wars with all these different creatures. That's kind of like what Matthew was like. He would go and hang out with his friends, and people would look at them like, oh my gosh, what in the world? They were not liked, and they were looked at like traitors and so on. So Jesus comes along and finds him and says, follow me. And Matthew gets up and follows him. And believe it or not, Matthew, Levi, probably gave up more than any of the other disciples in terms of worldly accretions, worldly wealth, than any of the other disciples, and burned his bridges. You notice that when Jesus called the fishermen, Peter, James, and John, and Andrew, when the resurrection has happened and Jesus has ascended into heaven, they go back to fishing. And Matthew couldn't go back to tax collecting. Once you left that, somebody else with more seniority would get put into your position. You were done. So he, like, not only did he leave his possession, his occupation, but he burned all of his bridges behind him. So he goes and follows Jesus. The hated sinner becomes a follower of Christ. To do what? What is he then to do besides go follow Jesus and listen to him? He gets it. He gets it right from the very beginning. He invites Jesus back to his house for a reception. I'll call it a reception because we're in church. But it was a gathering of these tax collectors and sinners. So I can guarantee you it wasn't a prayer service. They're having a party to welcome Jesus. And Matthew is so excited, he gathers all of his friends together and says, let's get together and have a party. And of course, this is where the rift begins to take place between Jesus and the religious leaders. Because the religious leaders would never countenance spending time with people like that. To go and eat with someone is tacit approval of them and acceptance of them. In other words, to share what they call table fellowship with somebody would be, is tacit to saying, yes, you and I are on the same plane. I accept you, you accept me. Think of it this way. Imagine if they captured somebody from ISIS, and they gave you an opportunity to go have lunch with the guy. And you would go and sit down with him over lunch. Probably most of us would feel a little bit of a hesitation there, because we wouldn't want to make him think, or anybody else think, that we were trying to accept them. They have to pay for their crimes, of course. So, why should we be spending time and money eating with them? That's the kind of thing that was going on here with Jesus. He eats with the tax collectors and sinners. The religious people look at that and say, why is he doing that? How can he be a teacher of righteousness and spend time with people like that? That was the this, at the beginning of the Gospel of Mark, is the beginning of the rift that you see between Jesus and the Pharisees and scribes and Herodians. And mostly it starts because they think he's hanging out with the wrong crowd. They would avoid that kind of contamination. The common person in Jesus' day didn't keep all of the scribal laws. Do you remember in the, I'm trying to think which gospel it's in, the Sanhedrin is meeting to talk about Jesus. And one of the things that they say is that he's with these common people who are accursed because they don't know the law. In other words, the Sanhedrin and the Pharisees, the really seriously religious people, looked down on people like that because they didn't keep all of the scribal laws. And so there was the beginning of the rift. And the scribes and the Pharisees would look down on people like that with contempt. Nothing more clearly shows the difference between Jesus and the religious leaders than this kind of issue right here. The way that they treated people. Jesus loved and sought out and accepted common folks like that, who weren't necessarily involved in any more sin than anybody else, whereas the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sanhedrin looked down upon them. All of them, notice this, I want you to notice this before we leave this and go on to the next verse or two. All of them were sinners in need of forgiveness. All of them. Whether they were scribes or Pharisees or tax collectors or people who didn't keep the law like them, everybody was a sinner in need of forgiveness. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Verse 17. Let me read that real quick. This is what Jesus' explanation. He hears that people are complaining about this and eating with tax collectors and sinners, and Jesus says, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. In saying that, he is not saying that there are good people who don't need Jesus. He's not saying that there's a class of people who are righteous who don't need him and forgiveness and what he came to bring to us. What he's saying is that the one person for whom Jesus can do nothing is the person who thinks that they're better than others, who thinks that they're so much better than others that they don't need anything even that Jesus has to give them. That's the person who's out in the cold. And in that case, the scribes and the Pharisees and the religious leaders were the ones who were completely cut off from Jesus because they didn't think they needed him. Whereas the common folk knew that they needed a new way to relate to God that didn't involve keeping 600 rules that nobody could ever do unless you devoted yourself to it full time. They knew that they needed other kinds of access to God than what the Jewish religious establishment was providing. And Jesus gave it to them, and they were hungry for it. Remember how many times when you read in the Gospels would Jesus teach, and it says the common people, by which he means these people, were hearing him gladly. It was like water to their thirsty souls. The Pharisees could just pick at him. Well, he's not clear on his doctrine of election. Or something like that. They would pick on stuff. You know, he doesn't keep the law. He hasn't washed his hands like the rest of us should. Before he eats, he hasn't ceremonially cleansed himself. Look at his disciples. They're over there in that field. It's the Sabbath, and they're picking grain. How can they be godly? You know, you can only hang around people like that for so long before you say, you know, forget it. I can't keep your standard. And unfortunately, that very thing is the way a lot of people feel about church people today. A lot of people, when they think about church people, even though they don't know you, okay? They don't know you. That's why they think this. If they knew how wonderful you are, like I know how wonderful you are, they wouldn't think this. But people who are not in church oftentimes look at church people like that. Who can keep, all they want to do is tell you, no, stop. If you want to get right with God, you got to do this, you got to do this, you got to do this. You got to make a list of the things that you love doing the most and stop doing them. And you got to make a list of the things that you really don't like to do and start doing them, and then we can be friends. A lot of times that's the way people outside the church look at church people. Somehow we have to begin to break that down like Jesus did. Notice that Levi is called to follow Jesus by doing the same things that Jesus did. And he does it. Levi goes and gets all of his friends and brings them so that they can meet Jesus. The elders and the deacons that we're doing, ordaining and installing today are charged to keep that same mission in front of us all. Because it is, after all, Jesus who says, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, who think they don't need me, but the sinners. Some people know they need Christ, and some people need to be a little more convinced of their illness, shall we say. And that's one of the things that the elders and deacons are called to keep before us as a congregation. The fact of Christ's ministry to those that he came to reach. Let's close in a word of prayer. Lord,